Hello and welcome to Talking Churchill. Warren Dockter here. 70 years ago today, Winston Churchill opened the Conservatives' 1945 general election campaign with what has been regarded as an almost totally outrageous accusation. In his radio broadcast on June the 4th, he alleged that if elected, a Labor government would have to fall back on some form of Gestapo, doubtless very humanly directed in the first instance. Of course, he went on to lose the election by a landslide, and historians have generally seen this speech as a symbol, or one of the symbols, that went wrong with his election campaign. But what happened? I mean, did Churchill totally lose perspective, or is there another way to look at this? I'm speaking to Professor Richard Toye, and I wonder, Richard, is there any way that this Gestapo broadcast can be defended?
Well, I think there are two defences, or two possible defences of the speech, a philosophical one and a more immediately political or electoral one. And the philosophical one would be to say that what Churchill was putting across was perhaps a rather sort of unsophisticated or crude version of the ideas of F.A. Hayek. And Hayek had published in 1944 a book called The Road to Serfdom, which made the argument that even what appeared to be modest instalments of economic planning would inevitably lead in due course to a form of dictatorship, because each step of control would fail and therefore require another step of control, and that in due course political as well as economic freedoms would have to be removed. So it was a kind of a slippery slope argument. Now, Churchill may not have read the book himself, but he was certainly familiar with its core ideas, which were very much in the atmosphere in the latter part of World War II. And so even if he put it across in a way which might seem rather crude to us, this was nonetheless arguably a defensible philosophical position.
But what about the electoral justification or perspective on this speech, Richard?
Well, again, there is a possible justification for the speech that although we may see in retrospect that it wasn't necessarily very effective at the time, it certainly was condemned by many people, nonetheless it was part of a considered political strategy on Churchill's part, not simply the result of him going crazy. And I would argue that very much in his mind was the desire to reach out to liberal opinion. The Liberal Party itself had more or less collapsed by this stage, only won about a dozen seats in the 1945 election, and so there was a big pool of votes to be won, and Churchill was very much in this election wanting to emphasise his stature as a non-party national figure and as somebody who could make common cause with liberals against what he saw as the greater threat of socialism. Now again, we may say, well, it all backfired, but certainly there were some people who were noting in their diaries, ordinary voters who actually did respond to the appeal to liberal support that Churchill made. And we can also see that actually the Conservative Party's position in the opinion polls improved somewhat over the course of the election campaign. So although the Conservatives actually did very badly, the election campaign actually made their position, it would seem, somewhat better. So we can't just say that Churchill completely screwed everything up. One may well disagree with the contents of the speech, and I personally do, but that's not to say that this should be seen as a kind of a crazy mental aberration on Churchill's part. He had thought it through.
I mean, I take your point, Richard, but surely, just coming out of the Second World War, this is very extreme language that Churchill decides to use, and it seems to me that almost any sort of person studying politics or observers would think that this is a sort of, exaggerated, extremely exaggerated case to make. What do you think?
So certainly, in retrospect, the language that Churchill used can seem very shocking, and at the time, of course, to a lot of people it seemed ridiculous that he seemed to be accusing the Labour figures with whom he'd so very recently worked together in the coalition government during the war of being essentially ready to act like the Nazis. Nevertheless, it wasn't just Churchill who was doing this. There were lots of other people throwing similar accusations around. certainly many on the Conservative side, but there were those on the Labour side too who branded Churchill as a kind of Führer in their own language. And so I think that the trouble that Churchill had was that it wasn't that this language was completely out of bounds. It was simply that as Prime Minister and as a national wartime leader, it seemed particularly inappropriate, and that was what caused some of the negative reactions.
Of course, I mean that was Clement Attlee's exact point in his speech the following evening, right?
Yes, Attlee made a very effective reply the following evening. This was a man who had not achieved a great deal of prominence in the public mind, in spite of his role in the latter part of the war as Deputy Prime Minister and his role as a minister throughout 1940 to 1945. And this was really the point at which Attlee, who had already been Labour Party leader for 10 years, really perhaps made one of his most effective political interventions. And of course he made this somewhat ironic or sarcastic response, which he drew attention to the possible influence of Hayek, who he dismissed as a kind of a suspicious foreign professor, but he also made the distinction between Churchill as national leader of a wartime government and as party leader, and he said he sarcastically thanked Churchill for having drawn attention to the difference between his role as wartime leader and party leader. And so certainly, again, that was a broadcast which didn't get everybody's respect. Some people thought it was dull and boring. Nonetheless, overall, we can see that it was a very effective reply, and therefore I think it is possible to make both a political and to some extent a philosophical justification for what Churchill said, and yet nonetheless at the end of the day the Labour Party succeeded in getting the upper hand on this very important and high profile speech.
I think that's a very good point, Richard. And that's sort of all the time we have today on Talking Churchill. Thanks so much for tuning in, and stay tuned for more Churchilliana. Thank you very much.